Charlotte Winters sat in the corner of her father's study, her eyes scanning the dimly lit room as she waited for the inevitable confrontation. The scent of aged mahogany, leather-bound books, and expensive cigars lingered in the air, a familiar scent she had come to both love and resent. Her father, William Winters, a titan in the real estate world, had always preferred this room, his sanctuary, his fortress of solitude. But to Charlotte, it had always felt more like a cage, the walls closing in with every passing year, every missed opportunity to prove her worth to a man who had never truly seen her. Lilian, her stepmother, had long since claimed control of the Winters empire, at least in Charlotte's eyes. Though William had built his fortune from the ground up, it was Lilian who ruled the family, her icy grip around her husband's life, his business, and his legacy. Charlotte had never been good enough in Lilian's eyes, not as a daughter, not as a businesswoman, and certainly not as a woman deserving of the Winters name. But Lilian's manipulations had become more transparent as the years went on, and Charlotte had grown tired of playing the role of the dutiful, overlooked daughter. It wasn't until she found the drawer that things truly began to change. Charlotte had been sorting through her father's papers, preparing for a meeting with one of his top investors, when she noticed something strange. A drawer in the farthest corner of the study, usually locked and untouched, was slightly ajar. It wasn't unusual for her father to keep documents hidden away. He valued his privacy and preferred to handle most business matters behind closed doors. But there was something about the way this drawer was left open that made Charlotte uneasy. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled it open. Inside, she found a stack of papers, neatly organized but covered in financial jargon that at first glance seemed like ordinary business documents. But as she began flipping through the sheets, something caught her eye. Offshore accounts, transactions from the Winters Corporation, large sums of money being funneled into accounts bearing Lilian's name. The scale of it was staggering. Lilian had been embezzling from the Winters empire for years. The shock of it hit Charlotte like a cold wave, crashing over her. All the years of manipulation, the underhanded schemes, the slow suffocation of Charlotte's voice within the family business. Now it all made sense. Lilian had been hiding behind her husband's empire, stealing from him while simultaneously tightening her control over him. But that wasn't the worst part. It wasn't just the money. It was the sheer audacity, the blatant betrayal of trust, the destruction of everything her father had worked for. Charlotte's heart raced as the realization sank in. The inheritance that had always felt out of reach was not just her birthright, it was being stolen from her piece by piece by the woman who had taken everything from her. She slammed the drawer shut, her pulse quickening. There was no more room for hesitation, no more waiting for her father to see through Lilian's facade. This was it, the moment that would define everything to come. Charlotte's mind raced with possibilities, plans, and a deep, simmering rage. She knew exactly what she had to do. Lilian had spent years manipulating her father, keeping Charlotte in the shadows. But now Charlotte had something Lilian didn't expect. The truth. Instead of confronting her stepmother directly, Charlotte decided to play a much more dangerous game. A game of corporate warfare. She would use Lilian's own greed, her need for power against her. But more than that, Charlotte would make Lilian pay for every slight, every insult, every instance of betrayal. No longer would she be the passive bystander, the daughter trapped under Lilian's heel. It was time to take back what was rightfully hers. Charlotte was no longer the quiet, compliant woman she had been. She was a force to be reckoned with. And Lilian would pay. With her mind set, Charlotte took one last look around the study. Her father's empire would be hers. It was time to claim what had always been denied to her. The battle for the Winters' fortune had begun. Chapter 2. A Quiet Storm. The first step was always the hardest. Charlotte had spent years watching her father's empire from the sidelines, knowing that she was capable of so much more, but never being given the chance to prove it. Now, with the truth of Lilian's treachery in her hands, she couldn't afford to hesitate any longer. The time for subtlety had passed. She would dismantle Lilian's empire piece by piece, using the very tools that Lilian had once used to control her. Charlotte's initial plan was simple: expose Lilian's financial misconduct to the right people. But as she sat in her sleek modern office, overlooking the city skyline from her father's high-rise building, she realized that simply exposing Lilian's betrayal wasn't enough. Lilian wasn't some petty criminal to be caught in a trap of her own making. She was a master manipulator, capable of twisting every situation to her advantage. Charlotte needed to think bigger. Instead of confronting Lilian directly, Charlotte decided to leak carefully crafted pieces of information to some of Lilian's most powerful business rivals. At first, it would appear like nothing more than coincidence, small, inconspicuous details about Lilian's financial dealings, the kind that would raise questions but not immediately lead to a scandal. But those questions would slowly fester, spreading like a virus. The cracks in Lilian's facade would begin to show. Charlotte smiled to herself as she opened her laptop, drafting a series of anonymous emails to key players in the corporate world. She included documents that outlined suspicious offshore accounts, large transfers, and deals that seemed too good to be true. The timing had to be perfect. She needed to create doubt in the minds of Lilian's closest allies, to erode her reputation just enough so that the wolves would begin circling. It didn't take long for the storm to start brewing. Within weeks, Lilian's business partners began to distance themselves from her. One of her high-profile clients, a real estate tycoon with connections to government officials, publicly withdrew their support after rumors about Lilian's questionable financial practices began to spread. This was only the beginning. Charlotte's pulse quickened as she watched the effects ripple through Lilian's network. Her stepmother's empire was built on a delicate web of connections and favors, and now that web was starting to unravel. One by one, the businesses that had once stood firmly behind Lilian began to fold. Rival companies that had previously been content to play second fiddle to Lilian's empire began to step in, claiming the territories she had once dominated. The dominoes were falling, and Charlotte was the one pushing them. It wasn't long before Lilian started to notice. Her once unshakable confidence wavered. Charlotte knew that it would take more than just a few rumors to bring Lilian down. The woman had weathered storms before, and she had an uncanny ability to recover from setbacks. But this was different. This time, Lilian had no idea who was behind the attacks on her reputation. And that, Charlotte knew, was the most dangerous thing of all. At the same time, Charlotte was making her own moves. As Lilian's deals began to crumble, Charlotte positioned herself as a savvy, ambitious leader in the world of real estate. She used the knowledge she had gained over the years, both from her father's empire and from observing Lilian's every move, to secure her own investors, building her own team of trusted allies. While Lilian's world was falling apart, Charlotte was quietly building a new empire. With each successful deal, Charlotte's confidence grew. She was no longer the girl who had spent her days in the background, watching as her father's empire was hijacked by Lilian. She was now a force to be reckoned with, a woman who would stop at nothing to take what was rightfully hers. But with power came responsibility. Charlotte knew that the more she manipulated the system, the more she risked losing herself in the process. The victories were sweet, but they came at a price. She began to notice the changes in herself. Her once easygoing nature had given way to a ruthlessness she hadn't recognized before. She no longer felt the need to explain herself to anyone. Her relationships began to suffer. Friends and family grew concerned as they saw the change in her. Her brother Nathaniel, who had always been close to her, began to pull away. He was a soft-spoken man, a lawyer by trade, and had always been the more ethical one of the two. "Char, you've changed," he said one evening, as they sat at the dinner table of their childhood home. "This isn't you. You're better than this." Charlotte's eyes hardened. She didn't need Nathaniel's concern. He didn't understand what it was like to be trapped in a game where only the ruthless survived. "You don't get it, Nate," she replied coldly. "I'm not playing by anyone's rules anymore." Nathaniel's silence was a sharp reminder that she was beginning to alienate the few people she had left. But Charlotte was no longer interested in their opinions. She had a goal, and she would stop at nothing to achieve it. As the days passed, the results of her plan became more apparent. Lilian was no longer the untouchable force she had once been. Her influence was waning, her deals falling apart, and her image tarnished beyond repair. The press picked up on the scandal, and whispers of her financial indiscretions began to fill the air. But Charlotte wasn't satisfied yet, not by a long shot. She had watched Lilian for years, waiting for this moment. But as the pieces fell into place, Charlotte found herself questioning what she had become. Was she any better than Lilian? Was this still about justice, or had it become about revenge? Charlotte shook the thought from her mind. She wasn't going to stop. She couldn't. Not now. Chapter 3. The Tipping Point. The weeks that followed felt like a high-speed race. Charlotte was no longer merely playing a game. She was the one setting the rules. The power she had long craved was finally in her grasp, but so too was something far darker. An overwhelming thirst that she couldn't quite identify, but that had consumed her every waking moment. The cracks in Lilian's empire were widening, but Charlotte wasn't content with small victories. She wanted complete control, and she wanted it fast. It was time for the final phase of her plan, time to make Lilian feel the full weight of her manipulation. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Charlotte found herself in the conference room staring at the sleek glass table in front of her. The faces of her investors had begun to blur together, as had the motivations behind each new deal. She had become a machine, calculating every move with precision, pushing forward relentlessly. The thought of Lilian, of her smug, self-satisfied face burned in her mind, but there was something else too, something nagging at the back of her thoughts. Guilt. A feeling she hadn't entertained in years. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. It was a text from Nathaniel. "You still planning on coming to Mom's anniversary dinner? I think you should reconsider. People are talking. Are you really okay with this?" Charlotte ignored it, throwing her phone aside. She didn't need to be lectured. She had a goal. She had made sacrifices to get here, and no one, least of all Nathaniel, was going to get in her way. A few days later, the tide of power shifted. It was the final blow to Lilian's crumbling empire. Charlotte had managed to orchestrate a deal that would acquire one of Lilian's last remaining companies, a property development firm that had once been one of her most lucrative ventures. The firm had been struggling for months, but it still had value. For Charlotte, it wasn't just about acquiring another piece of the puzzle. It was about stripping Lilian of everything, to make her feel the same humiliation that Charlotte had endured for years. The press had gotten wind of the acquisition. Charlotte watched from her office as the headlines rolled in. Charlotte Winters dismantles Lilian Winters' empire. And for a moment, she allowed herself to feel a rush of satisfaction. But that feeling was fleeting. Almost immediately after the news broke, Lilian made a public statement, a calm, measured response that only added to the mounting rumours. She had always been a skilled manipulator, and she was far from out of the game. Charlotte's phone rang. "Charlotte." Lilian's voice was smooth, almost too smooth. "I'm sure you know about my company's unfortunate situation, but I think you and I both know that this isn't over. You may have gotten the deal, but you're going to regret this." Charlotte's heart skipped a beat, but she quickly regained her composure. She had been expecting this. Lilian always had something up her sleeve. "I'm not the one who's going to regret anything, Lilian," Charlotte replied, her voice steely. "The world's moved on from your outdated ways. You should have known that." Lilian's laughter echoed through the line, chilling Charlotte to the core. "You think you've won, but I've been playing this game for years." Just remember, you're not the only one who can be ruthless. The call ended with a final click, and for the first time, Charlotte felt the weight of her actions settle heavily on her shoulders. She had thought this would be the moment she could finally breathe easy, that the battle would be over. But she had underestimated Lilian. It didn't take long for Charlotte to learn that Lilian had already begun to make her move. While Charlotte had been celebrating her latest victory, Lilian had been quietly securing her own alliances, new investors, new corporate partners, even new rivals. And now, she was turning the tables. Within days, news broke of a new legal investigation into Charlotte's dealings, specifically her acquisition of her father's assets. Some of the deals she'd executed using his empire were being called into question. There were whispers about unethical practices, shady financial transactions, and concerns about her sudden rise to power. Charlotte had played this game carefully, but she had always known that the line between success and failure was thin. She had danced on the edge of the law for so long that she had forgotten just how easily it could all come crashing down. It was then that she realized the full weight of Lilian's warning. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about survival. With Lilian's comeback looming, Charlotte's grip on her newfound empire began to feel less certain. The investigations into her finances weren't the only threat. The media was having a field day, questioning the legitimacy of Charlotte's rise. As her allies began to pull back, Charlotte found herself surrounded by enemies, many of whom had been quietly waiting for her to slip up. And then there was the discovery, the document Lilian had found. One of Charlotte's most secretive acquisitions was now under scrutiny, and it could bring everything crashing down. It was the breaking point, the moment when everything she had worked for seemed ready to implode. Charlotte sat in her office late one night, the weight of it all pressing down on her. Her phone buzzed once more. Another message from Nathaniel. "Mom wants to see you. I think you need to think about what you're doing, Char. This isn't you. You're not that person. You're getting lost in all of this." Her eyes narrowed as she stared at the screen, the words taunting her. The truth was, she wasn't sure who she was anymore. Was she still the woman who wanted justice? Or had she become something darker, something more dangerous? There were moments when she wasn't sure if she could stop herself. Chapter 4. The Depths of Deceit. Charlotte was drowning in a sea of contradictions. The initial thrill of outsmarting Lilian had faded, replaced by an ever-growing unease. With each new move, each new strategy she employed, the lines between right and wrong blurred further. The allegations against her were becoming more than just whispers. They were gaining traction. Every headline was a reminder that power was never as secure as it seemed. She sat in her penthouse late one evening, eyes fixed on the wall of news clippings, financial reports, and legal documents that had become her new obsession. Her father's empire, the very thing she had once dreamed of inheriting, was now slipping away, and she didn't know if it was the fault of her enemies or herself. Her phone buzzed, this time with an email from her attorney. "Charlotte, I suggest you take this seriously. The investigations into your use of your father's assets have intensified. We need to prepare for the worst." The worst. The words echoed in her mind like a death sentence. It was ironic. Charlotte had always thought that the only thing that mattered was winning. Now she wasn't sure if she'd won anything at all. But it wasn't just the press that had her on edge. As she pored over the financial records of her acquisitions, one document stood out, an email chain between her and a powerful banker, hidden within the depths of her own server. It was a transaction that should never have been uncovered. It had been meant to be a quiet deal, a one-off, buried beneath layers of complexity. But the email exchange had an unsettling tone. It wasn't just about business. There was something personal there, something that connected it back to William Winters himself. The realization hit her with a brutal force. Her father had known. He had known exactly what she was doing, the deals she had executed, the aggressive moves she had made to secure her position, had all been based on his assets. But there was something darker, something more intentional about it. William had always been a man who played the long game, but now she wondered if he had played it with her too. Charlotte felt the walls of her world close in. She had assumed her father's wealth was hers to claim. But if he had known what she was doing all along, had he planned for this too? Had he set her up to fail? Her mind was reeling, but she pushed the thoughts aside. There was no time to indulge in doubt. She had already come too far. The only way out now was to keep moving forward. But Lilian's presence in the media was growing by the day, while Charlotte tried to focus on the internal battle she was facing. Lilian had started to make public statements, casting doubt on Charlotte's legitimacy. As much as Charlotte hated to admit it, Lilian's poise in the face of the storm was impressive. Despite being forced into the role of a subjugated employee at one of Charlotte's companies, Lilian had played the victim flawlessly. The public rallied behind her. Charlotte needed to act fast. It wasn't enough to crush Lilian in business anymore. She had to destroy her image, her credibility, in a way that would make her untouchable. But how? That night, Charlotte found herself in a familiar place, her father's study. It was the same place where, years ago, she had uncovered the truth about Lilian's embezzling. Now, it was where she would have to uncover the next piece of the puzzle. The study was eerily quiet, the air thick with memories. Charlotte felt a pang of something deep, regret perhaps, or even nostalgia. She couldn't be sure. Sifting through the drawer that had once revealed Lilian's secrets, Charlotte found something unexpected. Old letters. Handwritten letters from William Winters, addressed to someone named Anna. The letters were dated years before Charlotte's birth. As she read through them, a sickening feeling settled in her gut. It was a long and emotional correspondence, one that spoke of a love that had burned brightly, but ultimately faded. A woman named Anna had been a part of her father's life before Lilian. From what Charlotte could piece together, it seemed Anna had been an early partner, someone William had once trusted, even loved, but whom he had cast aside when Lilian came into the picture. It seemed William had kept these letters hidden, as if Anna had never existed in his world. But to Charlotte, they revealed something even more chilling. This was not the first time her father had been blind to manipulation. Suddenly, Charlotte understood. This wasn't just about business or revenge. It was about control. William had always been controlled by those around him, and in his own way, he had controlled Charlotte too. He had made sure she would rise up to take what was rightfully hers, only to leave her unprepared for the cost. In a way, Charlotte was just another pawn in a game her father had started long before. But she wasn't about to be anyone's pawn, not anymore. With a new cold resolve, Charlotte began her next move. She would take Lilian down, not just by outsmarting her in business, but by destroying her public image, by exposing her deepest secrets. Charlotte knew that Lilian had skeletons in her closet. It was time to make sure the world knew just how far Lilian would go to keep control. The clock was ticking. Charlotte had to act fast before Lilian's comeback became a reality. The game was no longer just about business. It was about survival. Chapter 5. The Counterattack. Charlotte was walking a tightrope, the tension palpable with every calculated step. The battle with Lilian had reached a fever pitch. But now Charlotte knew she had to be smarter. No more mistakes, no more half measures. She had already bent the rules, danced on the edge of legality, and in many ways had become the very thing she had once despised. But none of that mattered now. The end game was near. It was time to bring Lilian to her knees, once and for all. Her plan was set. She would expose Lilian's dirty secrets, secrets Charlotte had uncovered during her years of research into Lilian's financial dealings. But she wasn't just going to leak them to the press like the rest of the world would expect. That would be too predictable. No, Charlotte had something far more sophisticated in mind. She would feed the media a perfectly crafted narrative, one where Lilian would be portrayed as the mastermind behind everything. Her father's downfall, the embezzlement, the exploitation of everyone who crossed her path. The people who had once been Lilian's allies would now see her as the villain of the story. Charlotte spent days assembling the pieces of her counterattack, carefully curated documents, staged anonymous tips to journalists, and evidence of Lilian's manipulative tactics. It was a masterstroke of corporate warfare, designed to ruin Lilian's public persona and crush any chance of a recovery. The world would finally see the truth. But there was one thing Charlotte hadn't counted on, the possibility that Lilian would anticipate this move and be prepared to retaliate. Charlotte's phone buzzed in the early morning hours just as she was about to send the final pieces of her strategy into motion. It was an encrypted message. She stared at it, her heart pounding. "Charlotte, I know what you're planning, but I suggest you stop while you still can. If you go any further, I will expose everything. All the deals, the lies, the money laundering, everything. It will be your name in the headlines next. You can't win this game." Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. The message was a direct threat, one that sent a chill down her spine. How had Lilian gotten wind of her plan so quickly? More importantly, how did she have the power to strike back so decisively? A sense of dread crept over Charlotte. The calm confidence she had once felt began to slip away. She had underestimated her stepmother. Lilian had always been a survivor. She would never go down without a fight. There was no time to waste. Charlotte knew she couldn't back down now, but she also knew that to expose Lilian's lies would be to expose her own. The battle for control of the Winters Empire had turned into a fight for survival, a fight that would ultimately define both women. Charlotte couldn't ignore the voice in her head that whispered doubts. She had been playing with fire for so long, and now it was threatening to consume everything. Her own greed had brought her this far. Was she willing to destroy Lilian and herself in the process? But the answer was clear. Charlotte couldn't stop. She had come too far. The inheritance she had been denied, the power that had always seemed just out of reach, was hers for the taking. She would be the one to control her fate. And if that meant taking down Lilian, so be it. Days passed as the tension between Charlotte and Lilian mounted. The media caught wind of the first leaks, and soon the world was buzzing with speculation. Lilian's name was being dragged through the mud, and every move she made only seemed to make matters worse. Her business deals faltered, clients pulled away, and her once prominent social status began to unravel. Charlotte watched from the shadows, the cold satisfaction of victory beginning to take hold. Lilian's career was crumbling, and soon Charlotte would be able to step in and claim her rightful place at the top. But just as it seemed that Lilian's empire was collapsing, something unexpected happened. A new development emerged, one that threatened to undo everything Charlotte had worked for. Lilian had struck back. In a daring move, Lilian had used her dwindling power to gather allies, quietly putting the pieces of her own counteroffensive into place. She had contacted some of Charlotte's investors, planting seeds of doubt about Charlotte's leadership, her methods, and her morality. Slowly but surely, the narrative began to shift. The public's sympathy, once squarely with Charlotte, now wavered. The corporate world was volatile. People weren't simply following Charlotte out of admiration anymore. They were following her because she seemed like the future. But Lilian's resilience, her ability to play the long game, had brought her a new wave of loyal backers. And now, Charlotte was caught in a tug-of-war for the soul of the Winters' fortune. The media blitz intensified, and with each passing day the stakes grew higher. Charlotte had to act fast to secure her position. If Lilian regained any semblance of control, it would be game over. But Charlotte had another secret weapon, the very strategy she had been working on, For months, her company, her real estate developments, had been a carefully crafted facade, one designed not just to outshine Lilian's empire, but to surpass it. Charlotte knew that the key to solidifying her future lay in one final, bold move. It was time to launch her crowning achievement. The deal she had secretly secured, one that would position her company as a major player in the real estate market, was set to go public. If she could pull it off, she would have the leverage she needed to put Lilian in a position where she had no choice but to back down. But as Charlotte prepared to make her move, she received a call. It was from one of her trusted allies, a confidant she thought she could count on. "I don't know how to say this, but you need to be careful, Charlotte. There's a leak. Someone on the inside has been working with Lilian. She's got the upper hand now. It's only a matter of time before she exposes everything. You've lost the element of surprise." Charlotte's pulse quickened as the weight of the situation sank in. This wasn't just about power. It was about survival. She had to outsmart Lilian, no matter what the cost. Chapter 6. The Final Reckoning. The weight of Charlotte's choices was becoming unbearable. With each passing hour, she could feel the noose tightening around her neck. Lilian, it seemed, had been playing a longer game, one Charlotte hadn't fully understood, but now it was too late for second thoughts. Every move Charlotte made was calculated with precision, but she couldn't help but feel the creeping fear that it was all slipping through her fingers. Lilian's counterattack had been swift and effective. She had rallied a network of allies, former partners, disgruntled employees, and key players in the business world, who were all too willing to sabotage Charlotte. A single leak to the press, a series of carefully timed revelations, and Charlotte's empire seemed to be unraveling in front of her. Her investors were starting to pull out. Her business deals were collapsing one after another. Her once promising rise to power now looked like a house of cards, fragile and easily toppled. Charlotte's phone buzzed again, the screen illuminating with a message that sent a chill through her. "It's over, Charlotte. You know what's at stake. And now you'll face the consequences. Your father would be ashamed." It was from Lilian. And it was more than just a threat, it was a promise. Charlotte had no doubt that Lilian had discovered something devastating, something that could ruin her for good. It was only a matter of time before Lilian exposed everything. Charlotte's leverage had evaporated, and in a game where perception was everything, she was losing ground by the second. Charlotte stood by the window, looking out over the city that she had fought so hard to control. She had spent years playing the game, manipulating, outsmarting, and clawing her way to the top. But the truth was the game had changed. She wasn't just fighting Lilian anymore. She was fighting herself. The lines between justice and revenge had blurred long ago. The moral compromises she had made had come at a greater cost than she could have imagined. For a moment, Charlotte considered walking away. It would be easy to abandon the empire, to let it all crumble and walk away with whatever remained of her dignity. But she couldn't. Not after everything she had sacrificed. The power was within her reach, and it was the only thing that mattered now. She would not let Lilian or anyone take that away from her. A knock on the door snapped Charlotte out of her thoughts. It was her lawyer, a grim look on his face as he entered. "Charlotte, we need to talk," he said, his voice low. "Lilian has gone public. The media is already picking up on the leaks, and the board is beginning to question your actions. If we don't act fast, you'll face legal consequences. I suggest we settle this before it gets worse." Charlotte's mind raced. Settlement? She hadn't fought this long to simply walk away, but the lawyer's words weighed heavily. A settlement could mean losing control, but it could also mean saving her future. It was a choice between saving herself or continuing to fight a battle she might lose. "I won't settle," Charlotte said, her voice hard, determined. "I will not back down. If she wants a war, she'll get one." The next few days were a blur of frantic meetings, phone calls, and legal maneuvering. The public was consumed by the battle between Charlotte and Lilian. with journalists speculating on every move, every counterattack. Charlotte's every decision was being scrutinized, and yet Lilian had the upper hand. It was clear that Lilian had been anticipating this moment for years. She had always known that Charlotte's thirst for power would eventually lead to this. But Charlotte had one last card to play. Her real estate development, her crowning achievement, was about to go public. The deal had the potential to turn everything around, to secure her place at the top once and for all. If she could just pull it off, the tide could turn in her favor. But just as she was preparing for the launch, another bombshell dropped. An anonymous whistleblower had come forward, exposing Charlotte's use of her father's assets to fund her real estate empire. The press jumped on it, and within hours the story went viral. The whispers of her questionable business dealings were no longer whispers. They were headlines. So, in one fell swoop, Charlotte's reputation was shattered. The very thing she had worked so hard to protect, the empire she had built on the ashes of Lilian's downfall, was now in jeopardy. She couldn't afford to let this scandal destroy her. She had to act, and fast. That night, as the storm of scandal raged around her, Charlotte sat alone in her office, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk. She was a woman cornered, but there was something else in her eyes now, a clarity that hadn't been there before. She had been playing this game for so long, using manipulation and power to carve out her place. But what had she truly won? She had alienated her family, lost the people she cared about, and sacrificed her soul for a crown that now seemed utterly meaningless. Her thirst for revenge against Lilian had only mirrored the very darkness that had consumed her stepmother. A realization hit Charlotte with full force. The wealth, the power, the control, it had all been a lie. A hollow pursuit that would never bring her the peace she had imagined. In the end, she had destroyed everything that mattered to her in the process. It was time to break the cycle. Charlotte called a press conference. The next morning she stood before the cameras, a sea of flashing lights blinding her as the world waited for her next move. But instead of the calculated defiance that had once characterized her every word, Charlotte spoke with raw honesty. I have made mistakes. I've hurt the people I love, and I've let ambition cloud my judgment, she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. But today, I'm here to say that I am done with this game. I will no longer fight for a legacy built on manipulation and deceit. I'm stepping away from the Winter's fortune, from everything I've built. It's time to let go. The reporters were stunned. No one had expected this. Charlotte had just walked away from everything, the power, the empire, the chance to finally beat Lilian at her own game. As Charlotte left the podium, she felt an unexpected sense of release. For the first time in years, she felt free. The Winter's empire, once a symbol of ruthless ambition, began to crumble. Charlotte's decision to walk away shocked the business world. But Lilian, too, found herself facing the consequences of her actions. The foundation that Charlotte's father had set up, one aimed at empowering young women to break free from manipulative family dynamics, became the true legacy of the Winter's name. Neither woman had inherited the wealth they had fought for. Instead, they were left to face the wreckage of their ambitions, with nothing but the consequences of their choices. The battle for the Winter's fortune had come to an end. And in the silence that followed, both Charlotte and Lilian were left to grapple with the truth they had both sought to bury, that revenge and power were empty pursuits. The true inheritance, it seemed, was not the wealth they had craved, but the hard-won lessons of self-awareness, redemption, and letting go.